This is a 2013 Mercedes E350 Coup. This has the M276 60-degree direct fuel injected, normally aspirated V6 engine. Now this is the flex fuel engine. This vehicle comes to us with a dead miss. We're going to take a look at the scan tool in just a moment, but the dead miss was on cylinder number 1. And after carefully inspecting the plugs and the coils and swapping plugs and coils, there was absolutely no change. Looking at the plug from cylinder number 1, it was very clear that didn't seem to be any fuel injected. So swapping the fuel injectors, the direct fuel injectors, number 1 and number 2, there on the right side, the problem definitely moved with the injector. Now we're actually using the scan tool. Okay, now here we see our stored fault code. Now previously, when we had used the scan tool without swapping the injectors, we had cylinder number 1. Now as I exchanged the high pressure injector, cylinder 1 and 2, now the problem moves with the injector there to cylinder number 2. Now what we have done is we have purchased a used injector, and we're going to install that today. Now this is a used injector off of eBay. They call it a remanufactured injector, and as you can see, they have actually cleaned it up very nicely and have replaced the top O-ring and the Teflon seal. There's a brand new Teflon seal there on the injector, and they've cleaned it very carefully and might even have checked it for a spray pattern and on-off operation. Now this is a piezoelectric injector. We have a series of piezoelectric discs that when we apply a voltage, a slight current flows, and the piezoelectric discs are going to expand slightly, and actually only about 1/1000th of an inch, but that's enough to go ahead and open the injector and allow fuel to be introduced into the cylinder. The advantage of the piezoelectric injector is its response is very quick. And here on our Mercedes, they're giving us up to, I think, 4 injection events per combustion cycle. So there I can start to inject fuel just before top dead center, just before igniting the mixture with the spark plug, and then follow it on down during the power stroke. Remember, I'm injecting fuel directly into the cylinder. Fuel rail pressure is going to be up there towards about 200 bar. So it's going to be very high. And obviously this designed injector can be used for both a diesel application, and of course this is gasoline, so here it's a gasoline direct injection vehicle. Okay, here we're getting ready to remove the number 2 injector, but in order to do that, obviously I'm going to have to remove this whole intake manifold. Now it's actually very simple. We just start first with the trim cover and gently lift it up. Next, I need to remove the V6 emblem. And what am I using here? I'm just using a Torx driver. This happens to be a T20. Now, on a Mercedes as well as a BMW and many of the European luxury cars, you want to be very careful handling the fasteners, because if you drop it, chances are it's going to disappear in this engine compartment, never to be seen again. And the same goes with your tools. So be careful. Don't just start setting fasteners and tools down in the engine compartment. Okay, now I'm ready to remove the 4 external Torx fasteners, and what I recommend is that you be armed with a E8 external Torx. And this is a magnet. Now, the magnet's not so critical here on these front ones, but I don't know how you're going to lift them up otherwise. Okay, here we're getting ready to remove our 4 Torx fasteners. They're external Torx. Here I have a magnet to remove it there from the well, and here I have my external Torx driver. Now I'm just quickly loosening these 2. Now I have 2 in the back, and you want to be very, very careful. A couple of things that I recommend. The first thing to do is pull this rubber seal piece away, and I need to get directly on them. Now I can actually see this one from the side, but I'm going to be very gentle going down on it, make sure I'm actually on it, and I've loosened it. Now as I withdraw this, I want to be very careful that I don't pull the socket off and drop it there in the engine compartment. And it's going to be very hard to recover. And I got to do the same thing here on this one here. So we come straight down on it. Here we go, I feel it, and I'm going to go ahead and loosen it. Now, what happens is as I actually loosen these, they're going to be very difficult to withdraw without dropping. So here's where the magnet comes into play. And what I'm going to do is I just simply reach down with the magnet and grab the fastener, and then I can very gently pull it out. There we did. We've recovered it without any problem. If we drop it in the engine compartment, it's hard to recover. In fact, it's going to go down behind the engine. There's actually a cover plate, an air dam, so it's going to be caught in the air dam, and you're going to be removing that. And you don't necessarily have to remove that to work on this aspect of the vehicle, so it'd be totally unnecessary operation. So here, what I've done is I've removed the socket, and now I'm carefully withdrawing the bolt. And here it comes. Now here on the front bolts, certainly I'm not going to drop them or lose them, but it's going to be difficult to withdraw them out of the well without the help of the magnet. So here I have the magnet in my hand. Go ahead and loosen these up. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and remove the two air cleaner retainer bolts. Now these are E10, and again I got the same situation where you're going to have trouble lifting the bolt out unless you get some help. And so I'm using a magnet. And you'll notice that every time I remove a bolt, I religiously remove it from the vehicle. Don't set it up on the vehicle, because what you'll find is that you will lose it. You start something like that, and it's not a good idea with a Mercedes. Alrighty, here we go. Now with the combination of the two bolts here, two bolts in the back, and the two bolts holding on the air cleaner, the only thing that I need to unplug now is simply the electrical connectors. Now on these Mercedes connectors, what we need to do is we're going to take a small screwdriver, and you've got to lift this tab up first, then squeeze it down, and it unplugs very nicely. You want to be careful not to break it, but if it's pushed forward like this, you've got to gently push it back and then just simply push it down, and it pulls out. Now here's the inlet air temperature sensor. This is the manifold absolute pressure sensor. You'll notice I do not have a mass airflow sensor on this particular model. The reason why is it estimates airflow based on engine speed and intake manifold air density, manifold absolute pressure, manifold air temperature. Here I see my crankcase ventilation tube. You want to just very gently pull it out, don't break anything, remove it from its retainer. We'll go ahead and carefully pull the crankshaft ventilation tube loose. Okay, now obviously I'm going to be removing the air cleaner. I'm going to pull this duct loose first, but before I do that, I need to carefully push back the retainer. Just push it gently back, push it in, pull the connector off. Now these are the little vacuum servos that are going to be controlling the flaps, controlling the duct there within the intake manifold. And so I'll actually have three. Yes. 1, 2, and 3. Reaching over here, let's go ahead and unplug this one, make sure this is pushed back, and just simply unplug. Now I've had this off before, obviously, so I actually put this little vacuum adapter in there. Otherwise I have to reach down in there and unplug the vacuum hose from the vacuum pump, or I can do it up here at this T, but it's a whole lot easier just simply to add that, and that's what I've done. Now here, this is actually a vacuum check valve and vacuum line that's going to allow the intake manifold to augment the vacuum pump. So I'm going to go ahead and carefully squeeze this and then remove this connector. And it's one of the famous Mercedes squeeze type. Simply squeeze and then it spreads the retainer and then carefully pull it off. Now you see on this style connector, you have to squeeze the connector right there, and it lifts up the retainer and allows you to pull it off. And sometimes it's hard to get in there to do that. Alright, this is a check valve and a vacuum line that's going to connect to the vacuum pump and vacuum brake booster and other vacuum auxiliaries, and this augments the vacuum pump. And one thing we mustn't forget is this is the positive crankcase ventilation line, and this is going to intake manifold vacuum. You'll notice this one is going to the air cleaner before the throttle body. This is actually going back to a a centrifugal separator there at the back of the camshaft, which we'll see in just a moment. And again, once it's in your hand, don't set it down. Secure it so it doesn't fall into the engine compartment. Okay, at this point we should be able to remove everything. Now, usually what happens, the way this is designed, is this is going to come out as one piece, one big piece. Now, I do have a special tool to release these style clamps, but it's unnecessary. Now, if you've got everything disconnected, then what happens is this whole intake manifold, plenum, throttle body, air cleaner, everything is going to come out as one assembly. One thing I'm forgetting here is the actual servo for the throttle body. It's not heavy, and it should just lift right out. If you have somebody to help you, that wouldn't be a bad idea. And now I'm going to take it over here to the cart, flip it upside down. Okay, here we see the air cleaner assembly, the throttle body, the upper portion of the intake manifold, and these are actually a silicone style seal which you're going to reuse. So let's move back over to the vehicle. Okay, here we're ready to go ahead and gain access to our injectors, and the first thing you want to do is to go ahead and unplug the 3 ignition coils. And again, the way Mercedes has designed this style is I have to push this back first, and then if I push it down, it should unplug very easily. There it goes. Push that back, push it down, connector comes right off. And obviously, make sure, of course, obviously the corresponding coil is to its correct connector. There we go, and the same thing true with our direct injectors. Here's cylinder number 1, number 2, and number 3, and that's it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on this particular vehicle. Now I'm just going to pick this up, just lay this down, go ahead and unplug the cam sensor just to get that out of the way. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove the fuel rail. It looks like there's enough clearance, so I wouldn't necessarily have to take the ignition coils off. Here's our crankcase ventilation system. This might pop off, but when you are putting the fuel rail back, be sure and put this back first. Alright, so now I'm getting ready to remove the fuel rail. Now, Mercedes recommends a procedure that you go through to go ahead and bleed off the pressure before you actually break the connection. Now, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to go ahead and loosen this fitting. Now keep in mind that fuel rail pressure is very high and it's retained when the engine is shut off. So as soon as I loosen that, obviously what's going to happen, I'm going to get a stream of fuel. So we want to be careful doing that. Okay, here I have a rag carefully placed over it, and there you can hear the fuel bleed off. There's not very much, obviously, but it is under considerable pressure, and I'm going to go ahead and remove this nut. Remember, the seal is actually a taper style high pressure steel, We were not going to put anything on these threads because the threads is not where the seal is. The seal is down here within the fuel rail. Now I also have to loosen this one too, so that I can lift the fuel rail up. And the reason, well, why am I loosening this one? It doesn't look like that's really necessary. Well, actually it is. You'll see what I mean here in just a moment. So I'm going to carefully crack this one. Now there's no pressure now because I obviously bled it off when I loosened the first one. So I just want to get this one loose. This will give me a little play here in this fitting and this line, just to allow me to lift this fuel rail up. And remember, we just had this fuel rail off because we swapped injectors. So here we go. Okay, now we've taken the high pressure fitting loose. So the fuel rail pressure is bled down. These are the actual fasteners that are holding the fuel rail down against the injector. Now there is a retainer assembly aid which has been removed, and the only reason I didn't put it back is because I knew I was going to be taking this apart. But there, as I go back with the replacement injector, we'll go ahead and refit that. What I recommend here is we want to be careful not to drop these bolts. I'm simply backing them out with a speed handle, and I'll pick them all up with the magnet. That way I won't risk dropping it in the engine compartment with my fingers. The little 60-degree V6, the M276, this is not too bad. I mean, I got a pretty roomy engine compartment, but the problem is once I drop a fastener, there's a air dam underneath the engine that you don't necessarily have to remove when working on this. And if you drop a bolt in it, well, then you're going to have to remove it to recover the bolt. So all 6 bolts are loosened, and now with the help of the magnet, we'll go ahead and recover each one. All right, now we're ready to pop the fuel rail off. What happens is that the injector is retained by a Teflon seal down in the cylinder head, and we have an O-ring up here at the top, and they're pretty stiff. It's not going to give up. And there's also a retainer that retains the injector to the fuel rail. Now you'll need to remove those retainers, otherwise you're not going to be able to sneak past this line. You could completely remove this line, but it's quite involved, and I elected not to do so. So what I'm going to do is use my little pry bar here, and again use common sense. I don't have any fuel rail pressure, so just carefully pick up. As you can see, it's lifting right up without any problem. There it goes. Okay, here it comes. All right, now I need to leave the injectors down in their cylinder head, and the way I'm going to do that, I need to separate the injector from the fuel rail, and this is actually a very good tool to do so. So what I do is this is just a set of snap ring pliers, and just gives it a little push very nicely, no damage, nice and even. There we go. Get your injectors coming off without any problem. There we go. Now, one thing I mentioned, not having to remove the coils, that's incorrect. We're going to have to go ahead and remove the fasteners from the 3 ignition coils. Otherwise, they're going to interfere with the fuel rail coming up. Now, the ignition coil is connected to the spark plug via a short spark plug wire. I can see we have a cut right there, but the just simply letting them drop out of the way is sufficient there for me to clear. Now we should be able to very gently lift that fuel rail up off the injectors. Okay, now I do have 2 alignment dowels right here that I seem to be hanging on slightly, so let's get the little pry bar back. Now, what am I hanging on? You'll see in just a moment. I have 2 alignment dowels, and they may stay with the fuel rail, they may stay with the head, so we got to kind of see what happens there. Okay, so here we've lifted it up, and here's the alignment dowels. This is going to give a little bit of a problem coming up. Okay, here we have our remanufactured injector there right off eBay. $55. It's used but has a new Teflon seal and a new O-ring. It's cleaned up nicely. There we see the part number. There we see made in Turkey. Now this injector pops right out so easily because this was actually in number 1 position. We moved it to number 2 for test purposes, and what we want to take a look at is see indeed do these part numbers match up. And let's take a look, and sure enough, 026 15 00065, made in Turkey. Very good. All right, we've got a new Teflon seal on there. Port's nice and clean. I'll make sure we don't introduce any type of foreign material. It looks good. Okay, here we're installing our replacement injector. We want to make sure that all the seals are in position, and they are. And we're going to go ahead, we don't put anything on the Teflon seal. Now they of course sized it for me, but it kind of expands a little bit. Might give me just a little bit of a fit going down in there. Let's just see what it feels like. So go ahead and push gently, and she is resisting. Let's see here, and I think she's going to be okay. I'm going to just press with the palm of my hand, and we hear a nice click as it goes into position. All right, now to actually replace the seals in the fuel rail, of course, obviously there's some disassembly involved. I did order a seal kit, but what happens, it hasn't arrived. And I'm going to go ahead and take a chance with these and carefully test for the leak. Now, sometimes these dowel pins will stay in the head, sometimes they stay with the fuel rail. And also I want to mention here, before we go back together, is that I actually have a seal right here that seals to this port. And what is this port? This is actually a vent port. If I have a seal failure up here, if we have on this Mercedes, if I have a seal failure between this high pressure seal and this blue O-ring, and gasoline seeps past, what it will do is it'll actually flow into this tube and actually be directed to the crankcase. And of course, seems like a disaster. If I had a major leak, it'd just fill the crankcase up with gasoline, but hopefully that won't happen. Now let me prove it to you. Now here, this is just simply a air gun. I'm going to put shop air to this port, squeeze it, and I can feel the air flowing here from the seal cavity between the high pressure seal and this seal on the injector. Now, if we were to lose that there on the valve cover, what would happen is obviously I would have an air leak to the crankcase. Now this is a speed density system, so it's not going to behave like a conventional false air leak on a mass airflow system, but what I'd have is I'd have a vent there to the crankcase, and I might get a little oil coming up here or draw a little air in there with my crankcase ventilation system working. So make sure, of course, that's in position. Now, to kind of assist right here with this fuel rail, what I've done is I've disconnected the high pressure fuel rail from the pump, from this fuel rail over on this side, loosen these two brackets, and see, it gives me a little bit of play here so that I can pick this up. And what I need to do is I need to very carefully lay this down on the injectors. I don't want to stress them at all. Get everybody lined up, and of course obviously I got to get my fuel rail back. Now, to make installation just a little bit easier, what I've done is I removed the two dowel pins from the fuel rail. They're just a slip fit, and I'm going to push these into the valve cover, and that will ease the installation of the fuel rail. Alright, now what I've done here with the fuel rail to assist here, I removed the dowels from the fuel rail and push them into the valve cover very gently, and this allows me to slip the fuel rail down over the injectors without any trouble. Now what I'm doing is just carefully pushing the fuel rail down on the injectors, just using a hand force. There, I'm carefully threading the fittings back on the high pressure fuel rail. I'm going to be tightening these up, and of course the torque is, you know, a few foot-pounds, but not excessive. Very high pressure fitting, but remember that the seal is against a sharp edge, so there's no sealant or anything goes on these threads. You just simply want to make sure that they start smoothly and thread on without any problem. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. And here we have our high pressure fitting at the pump. She's threading right on without any trouble, and I'll do this in just a moment. Now we'll go ahead and get our 6 bolts and carefully torque this down. And here I have my 6 bolts, and I'm just going to carefully run them in with the speed handle. I'm not doing any type of torquing or anything. I'm just getting them started there in the threads. I want to make sure that I torque down very evenly. Again, you want to be very careful not to drop a fastener in the engine compartment. Now, new, one of these injectors is very expensive, and of course obviously used is very reasonably priced. The part number is matched up exactly. And as we were mentioning, this injector costs us $55. All right. Okay, now this is actually an assembly aid and a retainer, and this is actually going to go between the injector and the fuel rail. And obviously, if I had the fuel line completely off, I could have these installed and retained in the fuel rail, but I didn't. So now I have to put them on afterwards, and so it goes in at an angle. And there we see the small end is going to slip onto the injector, and the large end is going to slip onto the fuel rail. Okay, here the fuel rail is loose and it's up, and I've pushed the injector down into the port without any problem. I'm just simply going to use this set of long needle nose pliers to just kind of gently coax the retainer in position. There we go. And as you can see, it locks the injector there into a relationship with the fuel rail, and that looks very nicely, and it's still loose. And of course we have our rubber seal right here without any problem. So now we're ready to go through and carefully torque our external torque capacitors. And here I'm using a speed handle, and I'm just very gently kind of bringing the head of the bolt there against the metal flange. Just want to very lightly, evenly torque the fuel rail down to the valve cover. And it's moving nicely, no problem. And you'll notice that a relationship is established with these retainers, and the retainer is working to kind of push the injector there into its port. It's very evenly along here. Now, of course, remember, I'm not going to develop high pressure in the system unless the engine's actually turning, because obviously there's a 3-lobe cam here in the back that's actually actuating the plunger of the high pressure fuel pump. Now, obviously the low pressure pump in the tank will come on for a moment as I turn the key on before cranking, and then of course as the engine cranks and runs, the fuel pump module will control that fuel pump and maintain the low pressure feed pressure to the high pressure pump. And then I have a pressure feedback here on the high pressure rail that will allow me to control through a solenoid the high pressure pump and the fuel rail pressure in the high pressure rails. Alright, so what I've done is I've carefully torqued down each one of our fasteners. Oftentimes you kind of get an estimation there based on the size of the bolt, and I'm probably doing about maybe 12 foot-pounds there. And we're gonna, in position, there we have our new injector, and we're ready to go ahead and reinstall the ignition coils, and away we go. Okay, now at this point, before installing the fuel rail, make darn sure that you put your crankcase ventilation hose back, and it just snaps right on there. And it's going to attach in here to the intake manifold. So there it goes. Go ahead and remove the dowels from the fuel rail and put them into the valve cover. And of course we talked about loosening the fittings right here and the fasteners to kind of give you a little play there in the high pressure fuel line. Okay, now we're ready to go ahead and install the high pressure rail. And go ahead and slip it into position, and there over each, very gently over each one of the injectors. There I have my alignment dowels, and we just very carefully push it down, and there it goes without any problem. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and install our 6 bolts, and I'm just barely turning them a few threads because I have to have a little bit of play there in the fuel rail to put the retainer back between the fuel rail and the injector. And that retainer is also going to maintain pressure against the injector down in its port. So it's something we definitely don't want to leave off. So here we're putting our 6 bolts, carefully threading them into position here. Be very careful not to drop one. Okay, now I'm ready to put my injector retainers on. Okay, here are the injector retainers, and they're going to exactly position the injector. And what this is doing is it's going, the large section is going to go up on the fuel rail, and the smaller sections are going to go along the body of the injector. And so what I'm going to do is carefully position this and slide it into position. Okay, here what I need to do is I need to lift the fuel rail up a little bit, and I need to push the injector down. And this is just a set of snap ring pliers, and you'll notice that I'm just very carefully pushing the injector away from the fuel rail, just so it allows me to insert the retainer. So we're just going along here and just very gently pushing the injector away from the fuel rail. Okay, now here I have the 3 retainers, and remember that I have to let the fuel rail come up, and I have to push the injector down, and you don't force it. It should slip right on. You'll notice that it also positions the connector of the injector. And as I bolt this fuel rail down, it's actually going to press the injector into the corresponding cylinder port. Okay, now I'm ready to torque down my high pressure fuel lines. You want to go ahead and thread the nut on by hand, and this is probably maybe about 15 to 20 foot-pounds, not excessive. Be careful. Make sure it seats properly. Nothing goes on the threads. Okay, here we see the outlet of the high pressure pump. It feels good. Here we see the right fuel rail. Gently go ahead and draw it up. Carefully torque it, not excessive. And then here we go on the left fuel rail. Why did I loosen the left fuel rail? Well, the reason why is to gain a little flexibility on the line. That's all. So we're going to go over here and carefully torque that. Not excessive now. Okay, and then of course I got to retorque my retainers. Okay, here we see the 3 ignition coils and their corresponding wires connected to the plugs. The injectors are all hooked up, and of course obviously we don't want to mix up any of these connectors because of course obviously cylinder 1 and cylinder 2 coil and plug, they're precisely timed to the crankshaft position, and that of course obviously is going to give us a real problem if we decided to switch them. Okay, now these are just silicone gaskets. These look like they can be reused probably several times, and they slip right on. There's actually a alignment slot there, which I am targeting there as I put this on, and so it's slipping right into position. Okay, we've carefully installed our 6 silicone gaskets, and now we're ready to set the intake manifold into position. The intake manifold is going to be retained with 4 Torx bolts, and of course we have the corresponding vacuum hoses and electrical connectors there going to the corresponding devices. Okay, here we have the intake manifold, and we'll go ahead and air cleaner everything all together. Carefully set it in position. Now the air cleaner is retained here at the bottom and at the top. We'll go ahead and carefully position that, and we want to make sure that the intake manifold is in the correct position. Okay, here we are running on all 6 cylinders, no check engine light. Here our customer is going to be very happy. Actually, there is no customer. This is a used car. It hasn't been sold yet. Here's the old injector. I'm going to go ahead and take a pipe cutter, and we'll show this on the video, and cut it in half so we can dump it out and take a look at how it's designed inside. And this, of course, is a piezo injector, so I should have a stack of piezo elements that are going to expand and contract ever so slightly as I apply a voltage in one polarity and then the other. Voltage applied is about 125 volts, and this is a capacitive load, so very little current actually flows. And the current that flows to open the injector is somewhat returned as the injector closes, and I reverse the polarity, and of course obviously there's losses as I overcome the resistance of the piezo element and the wiring and the driver. Now there is a resistor in parallel across the piezo element. We'll examine that with our own meter and maybe even see it physically as we take it apart.